Representative Edwards, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, Matt. Glad to be with you.
Why don't we start with your background? You've had quite a career with lots of time in and out of government. Could you give us kind of your own perspective on your career and your history?
It's been a long career. I started out as a journalist, newspaper man. I have a journalism degree, and worked for newspapers. And then I ran for Congress, served 16 years in Congress. Worked a little bit for an ad agency at one point, and before I went to Congress. And I'm a teacher, and I love teaching. So after my 16 years in Congress, I went and I taught at Harvard for the next 11 years. And then I went to Princeton, and then I went back. I was asked to go back to Washington, the Aspen Institute, where I was a vice president, and created a political leadership program for young elected officials, all handpicked by me, 24 at a time, 12 Democrats, 12 Republicans from around the country, who were, I thought of as rising stars. So one was a local district attorney in San Francisco named Kamala Harris. One was a city councilman Eric Garcetti, who is now the mayor of Los Angeles. He's going to be the new ambassador to India. Stacey Abrams, who in Georgia, who is a state legislator. So there are a number of members of Congress, a number of governors, a former national chairman of the Republican Party and former national chairman of the Democratic Party, who all came through my program. So a lot of members of state legislatures. So I've done that, and now I'm back at Princeton again. In terms of prior to that, and prior to my career, I grew up in very modest. I don't want to say poor, because there are some people who are, really deep poor, but in maybe the bottom half of middle income, and a Jewish family that had come from Poland and Lithuania, and nobody in my family had ever gone to college before. And so, I unlike the perception of who serves in government and where they come from, a lot of people like me who in fact came out of nowhere and decided to run. That's what we do in America. You run because you self-select. I'm going to run. I want to do that. And so that's kind of what it is, kind of where I came from.
And so your time in Congress, can you talk a little bit about that? What sort of committees or positions did you hold, and a little bit of perspective on, from the beginning until the end?
Sure. When I got there, I must say that on the first day, I mentioned that we came from a low-income Jewish family, and the very first day that I was sworn in, my mother was my father had died, but my mother was in the audience watching, and she said afterwards, which I'll never forget, she said, "Who are we to have a member of Congress in our family?" And because there is this perception, especially if you're not from America originally or haven't been familiar, there's this perception that, holding offices, members of Congress or Parliament or whatever, that's for the elites, right? And who are we to have somebody who's in a position like that? I won't ever forget that. That was a telling moment. I worked as a staffer for a while on the Hill. And to be quite frank, I decided to run. I'd always cared about Congress, cared a lot about it, but I decided to actually run because I was the editor of a medical journal. I left that part out. Editor of a medical journal. I've done a lot of different things. And so I went to the Hill as a staffer, as an expert on healthcare. But I looked around, I watched these members I was working with and said, well, I can do this job better than they can. So I went back and ran for office, and to show that I'm not as brilliant as I want people to think I am. I'm a Republican. I was a Republican. I'm not a Republican anymore. But as a Republican, I ran in a district that had not elected a Republican since 1928. my district was 74% Democrats, overwhelming. Everybody they elected to anything was Democrats. But I got 49% of the votes, so the incumbent decided to hang it up, and I ran the next time and I won, and became the first Republican in that district in well over a quarter century. And so that's kind of how I got started. When I got to Congress, we were in the minority. My Republican Party was very much in the minority, but I served on the Education and Labor Committee. I served on the Interior Committee, so I can prove to you, Matt, that I am not radioactive, because I was on the small task force that investigated the accident at 3 Mile Island, wearing our hazmat suits, and then, Geiger counters or whatever they are afterwards, proved that I was not radioactive. Later, after a couple of years, I was selected for the Appropriations Committee. And then I was later on the Appropriations and the Budget Committee, one of the very few members to serve on both. I was elected to the Republican leadership and was chairman of the Republican Policy Committee in the House. So I was one of the top 4 party leaders in Congress. And, that was basically it. And when I left, I lost my last election after 16 years in a primary. And when I left, I didn't know what I was going to do, had no clue, hadn't talked to anybody about a job. I had been approached about being a lobbyist. I didn't want to be a lobbyist. And out of nowhere, the dean at the Kennedy School at Harvard said, "We've had several people contact us, say we ought to see if we can get you to come teach at Harvard." And so I said, okay, I have no idea what I was doing. I'd never been to the Boston area before in my life. But I had taught a little bit of law school after I went to law school at night, and had taught a course or two there. So I did it, and I loved teaching. I love it. They signed me up for, I think, 3 semesters and kept reappointing me, and I stayed there for 11 years. And then the dean at the Wilson School at Princeton asked me if I'd come over to Princeton to teach, which I did. Then I went back to Washington to the Aspen Institute, and now I've gone back to Princeton, where I'm a visiting professor there. And I love the classroom, and I love teaching, and so yeah, it's a lot of different careers, but they've all been fun.
Fantastic. Well, why don't we talk about some of the major themes that seem to recur in your background? And one of them is this idea of conservatism. And I think that notion has changed over time, at least according to some of the things that you've talked about. So can you talk to us about what does this mean, conservatism, and what's your perspective on it over time? Obviously, you've written on the subject extensively, but if you could talk a little through it.
Well, I wrote a book in 2008 called Reclaiming Conservatism, which was published by Oxford University Press. And that was tracing, I actually traced the changes in the Republican National Convention platform, from the 60s through George W. Bush, and showed how it changed. When I first came into Republican politics, I supported Barry Goldwater. And Barry Goldwater was a libertarian. He wasn't really a conservative. He was was for a very strong national defense, but he was more libertarian. It was more out of the John Locke kind of philosophy, of as much as possible, the people should be free to pursue their own lives. Wasn't anti-government, but it was government within its constitutional limits. And that's what I did. And that's who was basically dominating conservative politics at the time. I always used to say conservative was not really, that was a term that was applied to us by people in the media or academics. We were really something closer to a classical European liberal, out of John Locke. It was like focus on the individual and the individual's rights. Over time, but at the same time, so I became the national chairman of the American Conservative Union. I became one of the 3 founders of the Heritage Foundation. I was the chairman of the Conservative Political Action Conference. And I saw over time, people affiliated with those groups became much more like European conservatives. and by Winston Churchill is my idea of a European conservative. I thought he was a great wartime leader, but I'm not a big fan of Winston Churchill. And Churchill once said that he identified, he was asked what conservatism is. He said it's reverence for the church and the king. Whereas in America, we decidedly don't want a king, and we decidedly keep church and state separate. So it was very different. But I saw over time, there are people who are much more like that European conservative model, a strong leader, like a king or whatever, a strong leader, with as little pushback from the legislature as possible, and more religious, instead of religious diversity, more promoting a certain view of religion. And so what today is called conservatism and what was called conservatism in the mid-60s are very, very different animals. And so what I came to realize, and a lot of others who came into the movement when I did, was that what's going on now under the brand conservative really has nothing to do with what we thought. We were not anti-government, we were for limited government, but that's very different. We were not for a strong dictator kind of a king-like person at the top. We were for the Congress, and early editions of the Republican National Convention platform, would advocate having a stronger Congress to stand up against, an overreaching president. So it's really, Matt, it's hard question to answer because they're really different things. What we have today has no relationship whatsoever to the conservatism that existed in the 60s and the early 70s.
And so let's talk a little bit about this concept of conservatism in its traditional sense as applied to Congress. So you talked about limited government. You've talked about it as a way to balance, an overreaching executive potentially. Can you talk more about, I guess, in your original conception of conservatism, what should the Congress look like?
Well, what's the main feature of the Congress? I mean, there are a lot of things that are important in it, and I'll mention a couple later. But the main feature is separation of powers, and the subset under separation of powers is which is the first branch, and which is the branch that has the most power in the Constitution, not in terms of what's been seized since, but it's the Congress. Only Congress can declare war. I see every day people on the news referring to the president as our commander-in-chief. He's not our commander-in-chief. We don't have a commander-in-chief. He's commander-in-chief of the military when it's called into active service, but he is not commander-in-chief of the country. We don't have such a thing. So the model that the founders set up was the people's representatives in the House and the Senate were going to have the majority of power, control what money is spent, control whether you can go to war, control what our taxes are going to be, control what your spending is going to be and what you're going to spend it on. And that model, that constitutional model, is what conservatives used to support. We supported the Constitution in its form. The Constitution is a very clear, most political scientists don't know this, very clear break from the British system. It's a deliberate break from parliamentary systems. Parliamentary systems sort of meld the executive and legislative together. And our system is exactly the opposite. So that in Great Britain, for example, your party will determine whether or not you will represent, if I live in Massachusetts, the party will decide who's going to represent this area in Massachusetts in Congress. But our Constitution says you must be an actual resident, actual inhabitant of the state from which you're elected. Very opposite of their system. The Constitution says you cannot serve in the executive branch and legislative branch at the same time. The whole basis of parliamentary systems is that you serve in both at the same time. So our system is to divide power and not let power be concentrated. And that's what we as conservatives, when I came into this, really felt strongly about: avoiding the concentration of power.
And so it sounds like not only that, but you saw that the Congress, his power had been eroding already at that point, and it had lost its position as the primary driver of the American political system. Is that right?
Well, what I saw was the rise of the party system, so that if you had a Democrat in the White House and you had Democrats in Congress, they would go along with what the Democrat in the White House wanted to do. That was common, very uncommon, to stand up against a president of your own party. So that allowed presidents to grab more power. It was also true that if a president, there were problems that arose that seemed to many members of Congress, and this is legitimate, beyond their capacity to reasonably deal with. When you got to a place where there were nuclear weapons and missiles, and you required fast action, members of Congress, even like me, would say, I can sit here and insist that the president should not be able to respond, but we may not have, 3 weeks to debate and deliberate, about what to do. And so change in history, change in circumstances also caused the presidency to grow stronger. But for large part, it was not presidents grabbing power. It was Congress ceding power to the president. And one example of that is both parties now. I'll be very harsh here, but I mean it. I don't think either party cares about political process anymore, and democracy is all about process. That's what democracy is, not outcome, but process. And both parties want what they want. And therefore, if you have a president of your party in the White House, you want that president to exercise, executive orders, go around Congress, don't be slowed down by Congress. You've got the power, just do it. And that's one of the more scary things, that the separation of powers, which is where I started here, has eroded terribly.
Well, let's move on to party then, since that's the other major theme of your work, particularly over the last, for some time. And at this point, you've gone beyond party. You've given up on the concept. I'd love to hear I'd like to hear your perspective on party, and what's its appropriate role in the U.S. Political system. And then second, I'd like to think about a Congress without party, and what would that actually look like? But let's start first with your perspective on party.
Well, first of all, even though I'm very critical of the political party system, we're not going to get rid of political parties. We don't want to become China, right? We don't want to become a place that really shuts down the ability of people to push back against, the power of the party in power at the moment. So parties aren't going to go anywhere. The problem is not the existence of political parties, and you could call it a party, a club, anything you want to call it. The problem is that we have allowed them to actually, for their own purposes and to pursue their own agendas, to control elections and to control the legislative process. So here's what I mean. In terms of elections, in most states, if you run for Congress, you have to first run in a party primary. If you don't win your party's nomination, even if you would be by far the most popular person in the state and could easily win if everybody could vote, if you didn't win your party's nomination, you can't be on the ballot. The party controls this is as anti-democratic as you can get. The party controls what choices the voters can have in the fall, because you didn't win the primary, which is dominated generally by the most ardent, the most zealous, the most partisan. Then you can't run. Parties, the party that controls the state legislature gets to draw the congressional district lines and draw them so that they're not competitive, so that are not representative. It's just about what's going to get the votes to get my people elected, which is completely counter to what I said before about the idea of representative government. You have to be from the state that you're elected from. So that's a significant part of the problem that we have, Matt, is not parties existing, but parties being able to control. So what I'm trying to do is decouple parties from running the elections and running Congress so that they would become like the Chamber of Commerce, like the National Rifle Association or the Sierra Club or AARP. They would have the ability to raise money, support candidates, to ask you to vote for them, to organize for them, but they would not have the ability to decide who could be on the ballot, and they would not have the ability to decide what bills can be considered for a vote. You know, that you would you'd have a Congress that was not driven by party loyalty. Every other organization you belong to, a board of directors, you may have some of those. You sit around a table, you say, here are the problems we have. Here are the problems. You may favor a certain approach. I may favor a certain approach. Let's put it on the table and let's work out what we need to do. We do that in every single thing we do in our lives, in every collective enterprise we do, except political party. You don't divide. When you meet in any of those groups, you don't divide into rival political parties and say, okay, you come up with your plan, we'll come up with ours, we're going to beat you. You know, you don't do that in anything else in our lives, except in the political party system in government.
That's true. And the challenge, though, with Congress is that you have a large number of individual decision makers. So
Right.
in the House, you've got more than 400, 435 individual decision makers.
Right.
Now, how do you coordinate decisions in that case is the problem, right? Because a board of directors is only going to have, a limited number. It's not going to have 400. So that's why some scholars would claim there needs to be some other organizing force, like a party, to organize that group.
But Matt, that's total nonsense. What you do is, let's say 435 people get together, and there's 5 of you. You want to be the speaker. I want to be the speaker. 2 other people who want to be speaker, and so you go around and you campaign with the other people, and you say, look, I want to do this, or I'll help you get your bill advanced, or whatever, and then you have a vote among all the people who want to be speaker. Right now what happens is party A picks its nominee, and if they have one more vote than the other party, that their nominee will win, and party B does, and you start from the very first day as rivals trying to defeat each other, instead of people who are collectively part of a decision-making group who will bring up issues and sit around and debate them and meet and compromise and work out solutions.
All right, so I think the speaker is the easy one, right? So we've elected a speaker now without a party, so that's an advance.
You do understand that you don't even have to be a member of the House to be a speaker, right?
I've often wondered about that.
You don't have to be.
I know you don't, but
Congress could pick you, Matt, to be the speaker.
Who knows? Maybe it would be a good rule to have the speaker not be part of Congress and not.
Well,
to be part
actually,
of the party.
it's very funny that you said that. In Great Britain, when you're an elected speaker, you step down from your party.
Right, it's not a bad move.
Right.
So now the next question then I have, because the parties have created all kinds of institutional rules inside Congress that,
Right.
kind of embed the party system itself into Congress. So we have this concept of ranking member, for instance, in committees, and we have the concept of the majority and the minority
Right.
leadership, which are, they're creations of that have been inserted into Congress itself. They're not part of the original rules of Congress. They're not in the Constitution. So what would happen if you remove this concept of majority and minority leader, or if you remove the concept of ranking member on committees? How do you assign committee roles? If we just take committee roles, for instance, as our second challenge with no party, how do we get committees? How do we figure out who's on which committees?
So you have a committee, you have to set up rules, and you say, well, we're going to have a committee on commerce, whatever title you're going to call it, energy and commerce, it used to be, and then something else. and it'll deal with business issues and trade issues. So we're going to have 10 people on that committee, or 20 people on that committee, more likely. Everybody who wants to be on that committee, just enter into this thing. Every one of us in here got elected by the same number of people. We all have the same salary. We all took the same oath of office. We've all been elected. We'll have a drawing. We'll just have a drawing. We're all one group, so you can do it by lot. You can do it that way, or you can campaign for a chairmanship. Like, for example, right now, if you want to be the Democrats have a majority, and you want to be chairman of the committee dealing with foreign affairs, the party leadership will choose, but you will campaign in the Democratic caucus. If Matt's in line for it, but somebody else wants it, you're gonna campaign for that position, and the caucus will choose. Nothing different, except now instead of the 250 or whatever in your caucus, it'll be all 400 will vote on who should be chairman of that committee. You could deal now. What you do if you have no party structure is that the committee as a whole can decide what issues it will bring up and not. The Supreme Court of the United States as a group decides which cases they will hear and what they will not hear. So you can set up exactly the same structure. You can have somebody in charge of administration, who makes sure that things are scheduled. You could say that any bill, you introduce a bill, Matt, and you find 200 or 100, let's say you find 100 people who will co-sponsor it. Any bill that has the support of at least 100 members of Congress is automatically going to get a hearing on the floor and a debate and a vote. There are so many ways. The whole concept that you have to have a political club to tell you what to do is so mind-boggling and so insulting and so demeaning of members of Congress and of voters that it is just, it blows my mind. The idea that you need these people to guide us and steer us, and it's just, it's sick. It's really, so that's the problem we have.
So, there definitely sounds like there are mechanisms, and even online today with all kinds of technology, there's ways that people can coordinate their actions much better than they used to, and much more quickly than they could have.
Well, can I just quickly add to that?
Sure.
Because one of the arguments for a political party, and this is an argument that is absolutely true, absolutely fair, you need a way for people to organize against something government is trying to do. You have to have a way to be a counterforce. That may have been true in 1805, before the internet, before television, before all the means of communication. Now we can all find out anything we need to find out about you or about me, and about the issues we take. You don't need that anymore. So that may have been a legitimate argument at one point, but it's not now. And so that's one of the strongest reasons for party, and it's gone.